Hello, everybody. Hi, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to welcome Molly Bourne here to Atlanta and to Georgia Tech. Learned last night that she actually went to the University of Florida. So we ended up talking a little bit about the rivalries between football and such, and it was good that there are no such rivalries between Florida and Georgia Tech. But before I introduce our speaker, I want to share a little bit of history about the Doug Allen lecture series. I think that if my math is correct, this is the 18th lecture that we have held in this series. I want to give a special welcome to Kathy Allen, who is sitting here with us today. And I wanted to just share a few memories that I had about, well, not my own personal memories about Doug Allen, because I actually never met him. But I've met people who knew him when he was a faculty member here and they were students. And this was back when I was just starting my teaching career in Detroit. One of my close colleagues, who's a Georgia Tech alum, would often speak fondly about Doug and the lessons that he learned from Doug and how he continues to share those lessons with his own students today. I was in Detroit then about 8 years later, and I met another faculty member who joined us. She joined the Detroit Collaborative Design Center, and she also mentioned that, she said, "Oh, I'm a Georgia Tech grad as well," and then she talked about Doug Allen. And so it was really interesting to me to hear both of their stories from different times, and yet what was the common thread was just the impact that Doug had as an educator, as a mentor, as a friend, and just as a guide for these young architects as they were making their way in their careers. So over his 30-year career, he introduced thousands of architecture students to the history and the design of landscapes, into cities. And he would often talk about, this inextricable bond between architecture and landscape and how you can't think of one without the other. So I feel very fortunate that we're able to have Molly Bourne with us today and to share her work as it operates in this kind of intersection between art, architecture, and landscape. Molly sees landscape architecture practice as a medium to celebrate and explore the environment and our place within it. She is deeply dedicated to elevated design thinking that advances the public good. Since joining MNLA in 1999, Molly has led multidisciplinary, award-winning teams on high-profile projects for water parks, cultural institutions, and urban revitalization. Activating public space dialogue, tackling climate change, reclaiming industrial sites and shorelines, and protecting pollinators are just among her professional passions. And I think we'll probably hear some of that today. Molly also is committed to educating the next generation of landscape architects. She is a visiting lecturer at UPenn's Weitzman School of Design. She volunteers with the ACE Mentor programs in New York City high schools, and she enjoys engaging with both the profession and with public together, leads site tours, and ultimately always talks about how might we create more inspiring public environments, urban environments. Molly's key projects include the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, Waterline Square, the Theodore Roosevelt Sanctuary and Audubon Center Master Plan and Implementation, the Park and Public Space at Governor's Island, the renovation of Roberto Clemente State Park, and Governor's Island Park and Public Space. I have no doubt that after we hear Molly share her thoughts on sculpting dynamic public spaces, we will all be inspired to seize the opportunities to transform, to reimagine, and reconsider the multiple scapes of landscape. And I realize as I look at Bill Haley in the audience, I completely passed over asking Bill to come up to the stage and maybe say a few words very quickly about the Doug Allen Institute. I'm so sorry. Do you want to come on up?
Well, good afternoon. I don't have any prepared statements to make, so I just want to introduce myself. I'm Bill Haley. My connection with Doug Allen is we were good friends in college. We were fraternity brothers. We roomed together one quarter in the fraternity house. No secrets will be disclosed. After that, we lived together with some other guys in a church which had been converted to apartments. And we had a lot of fun with that. It was on Oconee Street in Athens. And it was a church, and it looked like a church, and it had a steeple, but it had a red door. And for some people, some reason, when people saw that red door, they thought it was a bar. So very frequently, someone would stop at the church and ask if we were open. We had the good fortune also to be right across the street from a little church that had a neon sign and a speaker with the, you've seen them on TV, that kind of voice. We got that. We had a lot of fun sitting on the porch listening to that. But Doug and I became very close friends. We got together a lot and over the years. We lived in the same neighborhood, Ansley Park. And we spent a lot of time communicating, talking, staying up late at night, sharing ideas. And I will tell you, he was one of the most brilliant people I've ever known. He was one of the best people I've ever known. He was a fine gentleman, and he was incredibly smart, but he had a talent for communication. And everybody who ever took one of his classes, and I won't say, I know from Georgia Tech that his class, particularly the history of urban form, was considered one of the best classes here then and ever, and people still talk about it. When Doug passed away, friends like I were heartbroken, but a decision was made to form what's called the Douglas C. Allen Institute for the Study of Cities. And that was formed by a group of friends and colleagues for the purpose of honoring him and in some fashion continuing what he's done. Now, the history of urban form, some of you have probably heard of it because it's legendary here at Tech. We have all the transcripts and we have a lot of the audio and the slides from that. We don't have them in final form yet, but we're getting close. We're at a stage of getting it done, and we've been working on it in the last week. And so that is something that's in the future, and it's going to happen. And one thing I have no right to say this now. I'm doing it completely on my own as a renegade. But at Georgia, we set up a little student support fund. Doesn't have a lot of money in it, but we set it up there. And I can tell you right now, we're going to set one up here too in honor of Doug Allen. It'll be the Student Support Fund or something like that. I don't know how cheap they'll let us get out to do it, but we want to do it. I'll be honest with you, I'm doing it more for Doug than I'm doing it for y'all. But you'll hear about it at some point in the future. And we'll be working on getting those lectures out where you'll be able to see them all online and hear Doug's voice. And one more little piece of news that you might find interesting. Some of the lectures, we do not have a recording of his voice. We have notes, in some cases, more or less a text. We have experimented. And when I played the AI version of Doug speaking the course information for my wife, she thought it was Doug. So that's remarkable, and that's exciting. But thank you for letting me have the opportunity to tell you about Doug and about the Doug Allen Institute.
Thank you, Bill. And now, please join me with a warm welcome to Molly Bourne.
I guess it's afternoon, huh? Good afternoon. I just am incredibly honored to be part of this lecture series. It really means so much to me. And what I hope today is that I can share with you some inspiration that I actually received when I went on a deep dive on the Institute's website. So what I'd like to do today is tell you a little bit about myself, tell you about our work, but I want to do it ahead of time in the kind of as inspired by this class that everyone loves. So I'm going to take you through that. Okay, so do it this way. Nope. Here we go. So I have lived my entire life on the East Coast of the United States. I was raised in Maryland. I went to college in Florida. I have worked and lived in Charleston and in Baltimore. Half of my life now, I have lived in New York City. So I think I'm officially a New Yorker. It's not so easy, but it is a kind of fun place and a place that I consider my home. You know, many of you are students, and I was fortunate as someone who was about 6 years into my career that I met two women who owned a business in New York City, Kim Matthews and Sydney Nielsen, that had the same values as I did, the same ideas about design and the same commitment to public open space. So I would really recommend when you go out and you graduate to find people that have the same values as you. And so I was lucky when I started at Matthews Nielsen. See if I can get. When I started at Matthews Nielsen, we were only 9 employees, and now we have grown to 35. I grew up with Matthews Nielsen. We are now called MNLA instead of Matthews Nielsen. And so I have been a partner for 11 years. And so one of the things that I feel that's really important is for the core values that we have that we can see that are expressed in our projects. Those core values have to do with reestablishing ecology, really growing up and trying to be part of a big public dialogue about open space and working at a very high level with really great consultants. I always say to people, this is a team sport. Remember that this is a team sport. Really reconnecting communities to water systems. And then also just helping people have better day-to-day lives so that the public open space can be vibrant. And also you're able to get around in it and it's very legible. And then working with incredible institutions like Georgia Tech, who's part of the New York Climate Exchange team. We've been working on this project now for 2 years, and Georgia Tech is one of our collaborators. So I feel very lucky to have a very broad practice and interesting projects that engage me, both on the level of intellect, but also on passion. So what I want to do today is talk to you about 2 projects. But those 2 projects, I want to put them in the kind of lens of Doug's class on urban form. And so I'm going to start out by talking about the city itself of New York, and then I'm going to take you and some of the kind of policy and things that impacted its form. And then we'll jump into 2 projects and you'll see how the legacy of some of that form actually basically translate across the projects. And so, okay, students, I'm gonna make a mistake that's a cardinal error. North right now is up, but in the rest of my slides, north is going to be at an angle. And to orient you, I want you just to think about the Hudson River and the East River. So East River is east, Hudson River is west. And so we're going to talk about these 2 projects that are in Manhattan. And New Yorkers think they're the center of the universe, but they're not. But these 2 projects have been, both of them took a very long time to realize, were impacted by very early settlement in New York. So one of the things that I want to talk about here is, and let's just stay here for a second. So one of the things you're seeing is the New York Harbor and the Atlantic Ocean. And so Long Island Sound is up over here. And so although we call it East River, it is not an East River. It is a tidal strait. That means the water goes this way and that way. And the Hudson River is actually also part of an estuary. So although it flows from very far north, it mixes at the bottom. So these big systems are very complex. They have many tides, and they also are very awe-inspiring. The rivers of New York and the waterways of New York really impacted and ignited its settlement, its economy, and kind of the way that we live in the city. So let's jump in to just Manhattan. So here we are. So again, this is the mistake that you guys should not do. I just changed the angle. So north is always up. And the reason that is because Manhattan is about a grid. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But so again, East River is on the right, Hudson River on the left, your left. So one of the things that's important that I know that you are part of your process, that's part of my process, is to look at historic maps and really understand the places and the context. And so one of the things that the background is created from GIS that I know you guys know how to use, and that all of the black outlines are from the way that the land looks today. And then the white dashed outline is the actual outline of Manhattan. So this is the first historical topo map from 1782 that I could find. I bet you guys would find a better one. But one thing you should notice is that Manhattan it's bumpy, it has a lot of topography, it has streams. And so you can start to see how it's a glaciated landscape. It was created from a glacier. And so this idea of these edges, they were softer, they were eroded. And so you'll see how that informs some of the designs on these two projects. Okay, so from 1776, I believe, to 1800, Manhattan increased its population by seven times. So someone said, woo, we need a plan. We better get a plan. So the commissioner's plan of 1811, which now again, we're seeing Manhattan. And so at the bottom, that is where actually the settlement started. And it went a little bit more organically. But then from 14th Street up, there was a grid laid out. It's about 800 by 200. And so that grid was laid out over top of this island and its topography and its streams, really without any consideration of the natural features. So now you can kind of see in 1811 the edges of the water and how that's working, and how that what you don't see is Central Park. At this time, no one lived beyond a certain amount. So it took many, many years. And again, I got a lot of inspiration from Doug's lecture about the reactionary parks. This idea of the grid was in a way relentless. But it was the first infrastructure project that Manhattan and New York took on. So they committed to it, and it was, I would say, 60 years in the making. So now we're going to jump to 1955. So the grid is built out. Central Park is in the center. And so that grid that creates kind of this regularity, and it's great because you get off the subway, you know, north is this way, south is this way. If you visit New York, always know that streets go east-west and evens are east. It's a good trick. But what people started to realize, because of the density and the population increase, they started to erase the grid and started to create what we call super blocks. And the super blocks you can see in the pink. And those super blocks will be part of these two projects. So with that in mind and those lenses, I want to take you through Waterline Square, and East Side Coastal Resiliency. I will try not to use acronyms, but everyone does for agencies, for names, for projects. So I will try not to, but we do that in order to be quick. So let's start with Waterline Square. So it's always important to understand that these projects are done by so many people. There's a huge team. This project, we started it in 2006, and then we finished it in 2020. It had a master plan that we were part of, and then slowly we implemented the master plan. So what I want to show you is the idea of working with an architect who has an idea, and then how to kind of bring that together so that it really creates a great space. So the project is on the west side of Manhattan. Hudson River is down here. It connects through, so there's Central Park, and the bottom of it is 60th Street at 59th Street. And so this is a super block that went from 59th Street to 61st. And from what they call West End Avenue, which is really 11th Avenue. And so it was one of the last pieces of development from the Riverside South project that was done in the 70s. It used to be a rail yard. This was then 70s. This actually went out of business and was bought and was developed, but those super blocks were very inward focused. So this was the last piece to be developed. And there's lots of fun and stuff online about it you can read, and a lot of drama. But the last piece, the developer hired Christian Portson Park to develop the design, and Portson Park had a lifelong kind of study of the open block and how to create dissimilar forms as opposed to an inward block. So we come on and realize that, oh, he's Parisian. Everything in Paris is the same height. He wants things to be high and low and have different forms. And so then, I am on tape, aren't I? The City of New York Planning Department starts freaking out because it's not a very traditional plan. So this idea of how do you mitigate in between these forms, but also really create a vibrant open space, that's where we jumped in 2006. One of the most aspects of this that we just, every time, all the way through from this idea started in 2006, all the way to the end of the construction, we were saying this. And you guys will create these concepts and you have to remember them and hold them dear. The 60th Street corridor visually had to stay open. And then there was a park on the west side, Riverside Park. We were trying to bring the park in so you could be led to the river. And so again, let's keep our eye on the 60th Street corridor. So the first idea, extend the 60th Street corridor. At the time this project started, there was not as much development on this side of Manhattan, on 11th Avenue. There used to be a lot of places where you would park car, like where you would go to buy a car if you had lots of money. So this was just an old kind of rail yard that was filled over time. And so the idea of cutting through there and making sure that you could see the river was very important. And then the idea was that we wanted to dissolve the grid and bring the grid in. So that grid that we talked about, that was part of the commissioner's plan, how can we kind of, as it comes into the site, then dissolve and have a much more different form? And then again, how do you connect across? And like many parts of Manhattan, and you can see, is that there's a highway that is along the edge of the island. And so that island we were trying to make sure that we could try to get past that and create better circulation to that. So we started to think about the type of open space that could do that with all these different forms. And so one of the biggest ideas was about integration. And that's a common theme in many of the projects we work on. The idea that you could create a a kind of home base for a plaza, and then also have a really vibrant dining areas and a meadow and playground, and really just make it as exciting as possible, so that this, not only could it sell real estate, but that it would create a new neighborhood. So while all of this seems very simple, in a way, the one thing that you always have to go back to is the site context. So as this was being designed, the understanding of how much the grade changed across the site. And so that's why I always talk about sculpting open space, because we're always thinking about the ground underneath us and how that topography works. So if you look, that there's about 23, 24 feet of grade change from the top to the bottom. And so when the buildings were put in, it was kind of like the buildings were just on a flat plinth. And so that was very difficult to figure out. And fun, actually. Grading is a lot of fun. So the idea was, how could we come in from the grid and keep it pretty flat, and then cascade down and cascade over? And so I hope that we did that. We studied it a lot, but again, and then just like simple idea of diagramming of like, what is this space about? I hope you're noticing the forms are all different. They're not just rectangles, right? They push and pull, they recede back sometimes to let the space in. But then what we're trying to do is create a center, and with that center, create very clear circulation so that you can get to the Hudson River and the parks associated with that. So one aspect of this, and you'll find in your careers, there's many ways to tell a story about a project. I'm going to tell you this one part of the story, which is really about how we created like 2.5 acres of open space using this idea of materiality and water and topography to draw you into the space, and for it to really bring down the scale of the buildings and also create great occupiable space that anybody could use, that you may not be able to afford the apartment in these buildings, but you could use the playground. That was one of our goals. So again, trying to make sure that you had these clear path lines. And this is even this one, you'll notice sometimes the buildings are different because the buildings were changing a lot. But this idea of porosity, and how do you really respect the porosity of the site? And so by doing that, one of the ideas was, how do we sculpt down using the playground so that it feels very dynamic? And then we have this beautiful McKimmead building behind it. So it creates the facade for that openness. And this is building 3, which Richard Meyer finished. Is Ports and Park designed all the forms, and then there were 5 other architects that finished the buildings. And so this idea of the porosity, that you're able to view across and view 59th Street, was important. And the idea that you could just feel like you could come right in. So one of the second inspirations from this was the idea of going back to that natural map. That natural map where all these edges have creeks. And so one of the ideas we wanted to do was unearth that creek and use water to bring you through the space. So this was kind of our partie of the Ports and Park buildings with all of their different shapes and forms, and the stream kind of leading you in. This is an early sketch. That was this idea of how could water do that? How can the water really work to do that? And so we studied it to understand, and now I'm flipping you around. So the idea that you would come down from the grid, and the plaza, which could be used different ways, but that had a fountain that was high enough that you could see it. And then you'd have a small runnel that was very reflective, and then an area that kind of tumbled down towards the river that was surrounded by riparian vegetation because you're going towards the river. So it had different expressions, and we wanted you to have different feelings. the plaza fountain is in the grid, and the kind of proportions of the grid are based on the 1811 grid. So we played with that. And then the idea of like, how high does it need to be if you're walking down so you can see it? And then how quiet can the kind of water channel be? And then the cascade is in the back, which is a little bit more garden-esque. And studying it in 3D and making sure that we understood what that might do and how that could support this idea of the 60th Street corridor. And of course, modeling it, rendering it like you guys are probably doing this week of things, and really seeing what the scale is and seeing if this felt open and playful. And so these are the renderings. So this is it built. And so there's a lot of exploration and iteration between that rendered sketch and this installed fountain. What's great is everyone from the neighborhood plays in this in August. So they come from all over and they just have fun. And so it's been a hit with the neighborhood. So is the runnel that kind of, again, leads you to the more garden-esque area. And then this quieter space that is part of the coniferous and kind of riparian garden. And so you'll notice that the materials change as you go from urban to natural. They start to get a little more earthy and brown, and they're buttoned up near the grid. So using those type of hints and materiality to tell the story of us bringing this idea of the urban fabric through, and then it really dissolving into a kind of language of the river. So that's what it looks like all the way across. And so then this is a public service message to future architects. Please work closely with all of your disciplines. We were very lucky that we were working tightly with the structural engineer and all the architects, because where they think the bottom of something is, I think it's the top. And I want soil on top of it. And so not only did we have many, many conversations and coordination, and it's really important to let people have their expertise and help you achieve your vision, but also let them hear you. One easy way to do that is by doing drawings. One of the best things you can do to have a conversation is create a sketch or a drawing that says, this is the top of slab and this is the top of my planter. I need this much depth. And so this is all on structure. What's underneath is an amenity space and a big parking garage. So this park is completely on top of concrete. And it was really interesting and very, very technically challenging, but the ideas were, because it had a strong concept, we were able to pull it across and really kind of achieve that idea with a whole team really helping us do that. And so there's that view again, with the lawn space and the runnel coming down and then it cascading through. And you can see some of the kind of interesting forms of the Ports and Park / all the other architects' buildings. This is building one and it anchors the space. And we thought all the buildings had different personalities, and everyone liked them differently. So this was completed in 2020, in September, right during the pandemic. So it was a really great opening for people that had been inside for a very long time. Okay, take a sip of water. So this is the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project, also known as ESCRA. Huge team again. And this is 2.4 miles of flood protection on Lower East Side. It's down here. So again, East Side is right there. So this is the historic map of the grid being laid out over top of and kind of respecting where the floodplains. You see the little orange over there? That's the floodplain. We're going to see that again. So the grid is laid out without really any consideration for that floodplain system. New York City has a legacy, like many cities, of creating new ground from landfill. This was helpful when we were excavating subways, and some of it has some really interesting stories. So here we are on the Lower East Side. That's the Williamsburg Bridge, and this is what they call the FDR. Right above is actually a gas and a coal purifier plant. And so this is 1937. And so in 1939, Robert Moses created the East River Park and the FDR. And at that time, the FDR was at grade. It was flush. And it snaked through the Lower East Side, which was actually full of tenements. And the density was quite intense. But the idea, and it's kind of nice to know that you had the same idea as Robert Moses, because he's an interesting character in New York history. The idea was, how can you create open space for all the residents of the Lower East Side? And so this East River was created in 1939 from landfill and was primarily active recreation. Okay, so then jumping to 2012. I don't know how you guys, I actually, I'm sorry I didn't look it up. I don't know how you guys did in Sandy. Sandy was pretty traumatic for New Yorkers. That especially for people in Lower Manhattan. And so one of the things to know is, so here we are again, here's the FDR Drive, we're in the East River, there's that Williamsburg Bridge, but the idea is that the floodplain is very, very deep here. You can see the 2050 floodplain and the 2015, and this is all FEMA. I know there's many, many academics studying new ideas about coastal modeling, which I'm really excited about. Most of this project is thinking about coastal flooding with storm surge. And so on this side, you can see that East River Park is about elevation 8. Sometimes it's elevation 10. And so that's pretty low in regard to flooding. And the floodplain is very deep. So after the Superstorm Sandy rebuild by design comes in, and there's a competition. And the competition that, one of the part of the winning competition was the Big U. So this initially was a competition called the Big U that actually won and created funding for this. What was, again, really great for the Big U concept was flood protection and people can live together. It's not something that can be separated. And so how can we do that? Incredible team did that. I wasn't in part of RBD, but this, as it won the HUD money, became a project in New York City. And so it was assigned to the Department of Design and Construction. And so they started to take it on. In 2014, I started to work on this project in the feasibility concept. At that time in Lower Manhattan, the mayor basically committed to figuring out flood protection for Lower Manhattan. And so this is part of East Side Coastal Resiliency is 2.4 miles that's in the gray. But the rest of it, we're still figuring out. But our project was the first project. These projects have followed. So the extent of the project goes from 23rd, 25th Street down to Montgomery. And so that is near the Lower East Side, close to Chinatown, and then close to the East Village. This is what we call a compartment. In order to do flood protection, you have to close the flood protection. So this ties into high ground. This is where I'm going to use all these. And let's see, DDC, DOT, DPR, DEP, DEC, NYCHA. So the project that had many stakeholders besides the neighborhoods. That also, when it was a concept and a competition, it didn't have a client. Now it has a client and someone has to take care of it and it has to be realized. So it had very clear goals, and that's an important part of this. So I need to set up a bit of this technically so then I can show you how we kind of integrated it. So bear with me. The thing to remember is the first rule of ESCRA, flood protection. We have to do flood protection, and it was a very aggressive schedule. Second part is improve open space and access. And I was like, yay. And then really respond quickly. And the idea of meet the milestones so that we keep the funding. Okay, another one, DFE, design flood elevation. People always remember the one number. So I'm just going to tell you right now, ESCRA is designed to 16.5. Remember the floodplain map where the land is at elevation 8? So most of this protection will protect up to 16.5. It didn't always work that way. Through the life of the project, this DFE jumped and had mostly to do with funding and also what the current initiatives were in New York. So again, there's a lot of change and you have to kind of adapt when you're even doing climate projects. So the other thing to know, behind this compartment, there's 110,000 people. So I guess it's, and the very high density of what were those super blocks. Those super blocks were this idea of the tower in the park. This is one of the largest areas of public housing in New York. And during Sandy, they had incredibly tough time. And so this idea of creating flood protection was very important to the communities. So what it comes down to, the system is, it's a wall with several different deployables that have to do with gates. And so what you're seeing at the top with there's swing gates and roller gates. They're really big. I could show you some really great pictures of gates. But, and then it moves through and it becomes a wall. And the wall is what they consider a passive system. And a passive system is preferred because no one has to go out and close it or take care of it. And so as soon as you think about how you're creating flood protection, the next thing you need to think about is what is happening behind the flood protection for the drainage. And so this is part of the project, which is called a parallel conveyance, and it increases the capacity to pick up the stormwater behind the flood protection. That's what it looks like. There's like an express train of water that is able when there's a lot of storms. We also realized that all of the utilities in the area needed to be upgraded. And that was part of the project and also impacted how much of the disturbance. The other thing that was important was to, again, that second goal was how can you increase and better access to the parkland. So we replaced the pedestrian bridge at Corliers and Delancey. You'll see that again. And then 10th Street, and then we improved and preserved 6th and really tried to connect to both the ferry systems. And so this flood protection runs through 6 parks. And so many of those parks had to be completely renovated and are still being worked on and renovated. So most of the parks are owned by the New York City Parks Department, which is a very underfunded parks. And kind of the maintenance is always a big issue. So what we had to follow was the park standards. The one that is not is Stuyvesant Cove, which has a stakeholder who can actually take care of the park a little bit differently. Okay, so that's the rundown of ESCRA, except for now the fun part. The idea of how do you integrate flood protection into a parkland? So one thing to know about flood protection is you can't plant trees 15 feet on both sides. So then you have to think about that. How can you do that? You have to think about what programs don't have trees and can you put the flood wall below those programs? And then in some areas where the FDR already has walls and it's really narrow, then you would just have a wall. So at the ends of this, near Sty Cove, which is up there, and down here near Montgomery Street, you actually have quite a visible wall. And you're going to see it in the last picture. Both Big and One architecture did a beautiful design for it. It has kind of this really wavy basket weave that has to do with the speed you move across it. And we really looked to do the landscape so that we could mitigate the height of that wall. But it has the language of the infrastructure of the FDR. But then after, again, lots of meetings and lots of coordination and collaboration, we started to realize that, first of all, the Parks Department really wanted this active recreation, and we tried to make sure that we put back every bit of active recreation. And so one of the things you can do is you can put flood walls underneath big open fields. And so we also pushed out a little bit, because then you realize you're raising the park, right? We're not now down at 8. We're up at 16 sometimes, sometimes higher. But the flood wall is underneath much of that. So what you have is you have an expression of kind of this infrastructure at both ends, but then underneath you don't really see it except for the kind of muscular topography of the design. So that's the flood wall running through the Delancey section. This is Corliers and that's Delancey. And so underneath these athletic fields is this flood wall. And this is it under construction, almost complete from the Williamsburg Bridge south. And so can't really, there's not even a good, maybe right there, the little bit of the flood wall that you can see. But this idea of integrating infrastructure so that it benefits open space was one of the bigger goals that I had of the project. And one of the other aspects of it that we realized was in 1939, when this was designed, it was designed with a very Beaux-Arts kind of form. And then as the Parks Department took it over, much of those areas were fenced off. And so many times you came into the park on a fence because there's athletic fields and you have flying baseball. But we realized there was, because of the kind of redesign, there was so much passive space that we could take advantage of. So we could increase the passive space by changing the geometry. And so we worked with the community, and you learned that people who came into the park at Delancey Street never came into Houston Street. They were like, that's not my neighborhood. So you realize the importance of having a passive park at every crossing. And so what we did was we started to think of like, how could we gang together different types of program at the access points and then fit in the rest of the active recreation. Plus, recreation is changing. The idea that you have like these things that are very separate, thank God your generation is making it very mixy. And so we're doing things that are different and integrating that together. Also, used to be a playground was just put some kids there. Not anymore. It's multi-generational. Many different people want to use it. So the idea of just designing playgrounds for children, we wanted to expand that. And so we started to talk to the Parks Department of how could we think of play in a different way. So one of the things we developed was the nature exploration, which is this idea of free play. And it's kind of creates a center right off the Delancey Bridge. And that it also really creates a center and a lot of water play. The idea that you could have multi-generational kind of people playing there and also different ages. And it also, with this amount of disturbance, there's an incredible amount of tree loss. And so one of the things that we did was to write in the specs was how could we reuse that material? And so we worked with a company named Trilox, is a great company, to salvage many of the trees and stumps and reuse them on site. While it doesn't kind of heal some of the loss of the trees, it does kind of keep them immemorial. We also replaced, there was several sculptures that we are reusing in other parks. So the idea of salvaging material was very important. We also were trying to keep to the park standards because that's what they can maintain. But one of the fun things was we were able to use the park standards to design new benches, a new chase lounge, also to use the color code in a new way, interesting way, that really speak to the concept and the diversity of the neighborhood. And so the last thing I'm going to talk to you about is in response to that tree canopy, how do we reestablish a tree canopy given the fact that climate stress is happening and the vegetation is seeing it really quickly. So in the East River Park, there were only 61% of the trees were 3 species. And so there was lack of diversity. Many of the London plane trees were kind of dying and not doing very well. So the idea of creating as diverse a mix as possible was important to us. And then other considerations about planting. Besides species diversity, can we create habitat? Can we think about salt? And also, this idea of like, how can you really integrate it with a flood wall? So we created for East River Park and all the way through this idea of the layering of the planting that kind of works and weaves with the linear park and that increases the diversity of the species and creates kind of furry woodland edges in some places, and then others where there's kind of pastoral openings. And the idea of layering all of that to create really a new park. We have tagged 600 of the 1,200 trees that we're planting. So we're getting there, and they're getting installed. I do want to finish on Sty Cove, which is a floodable park, and that's on the north end. We have a partner there with Solar One, and this is the Economic Development Corporation's piece of land. So the idea that this is like 70 feet wide, it's a very skinny park, but that you would have only a certain amount of space because again, at the bottom, you have those offsets from that infrastructure. But again, same issues, but this is really about, this will be inundated with salt water at some time during a storm event. And so can you plant for that? Can you think for that, anticipate what that might need? But overall, another linear concept that has these different feelings of a woodland that you go to a shrubland and a grassland. And one of the things that's so important about grasslands is, especially when you have a good partner to take care of them, they're one of the habitats that has the most loss in the country. So the other thing you have to do is to build a good foundation of soils. So this is the special soil that we made sure happened in Sty Cove because it's a floodable landscape. And then here's the trees. And it opened, I guess, in May. This is the kind of that narrow Sty Cove, and you can see the flood wall in the back. And this is looking south towards Brooklyn. But this idea of really creating as much space as possible to create 2 tiers, that you also have this really great esplanade, but then you're also able to get away from it. And so this is where I want to leave you with these 2 projects. The idea that all of this work had strong concepts that I think most of that the team agreed to, and then also that helped us get all the way through implementation, and that we all coordinated and respected each other's kind of knowledge. But the other aspect is that working for me in the public, for public open space is incredibly rewarding because people get to live their lives in the spaces you create. You get yelled at community boards, and there was many lessons learned that we could have had from the community outreach on both of these. And so we always will take those forward, but I think that, it's exciting for me to think about a new all of your new ideas that you have and energy. The field needs it. So I look forward to taking your questions.
Hello. Awesome. Hi. Thank you. That was all very inspiring and informative. I did have a question that popped up for me near the end. You talked about increasing tree species diversity, which is good, but now I sound rude. I'm sorry, but I was curious if you considered native species versus non-native species. I know there are 3 tree species at the beginning and there are 50 at the end. How many of the ones at the beginning were native? How many of the ones at the end are native? And did you increase or decrease across that?
Excellent question. It's not rude at all. It's actually my bad for not being more specific. Many of the existing trees were not native. And I think that we're incredibly lucky that now people are understanding better about natives. And so with the idea of the diversity was to lean heavily on the natives. And so I don't have the percentage right off but I think we were shooting for 85%. I don't know if we got to it. Of all of the trees of the 51 species, I believe that we tried to get 81% and also the ground cover of native. Sty Cove is like a stopover for monarch butterflies. So that's an important one where we have all the different types of milkweed. But it is incredibly important and not that difficult to achieve. But I have to say, it's very hard to, you have to make sure that the contractor follows through and doesn't substitute. So, great question.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a really long question. I had to write it down. Basically, I'm currently researching the geography of the city of Atlanta for my spatial analytics class, and I learned about an online resource called the Environmental Justice Screening Tool. It contained data about a 100-year floodplain that runs through the city. Unfortunately, though, the website was just recently taken down, and all of the resources on the website disappeared. So what resources would you recommend that we use as students to learn about water, rivers, and flooding for the East Coast?
It's such a great question because it's shocking how difficult it is to get that information. And also and that's why I wanted to start with this idea of these big natural systems that influenced New York, which they did. I think that, we go straight to FEMA, right? But then and I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. But one of the things that I would make sure that you guys understand is many times when you're getting data that is already mashed up from something, you have to make sure you check that source. And so it's kind of pre-chewed information. What you want is raw data, as much raw data as possible. We're lucky because New York State has good layers and information. But I think one of the other things is the most important thing for you to do is to just understand where your data is from and cite it correctly. And so you can build that, and I'm sure if you build it carefully, then you understand what the criticality is. But it is a bit of a construction sometimes. And also, I didn't show the slide where no one asked me what is 8 versus 0. Is 0 sea level rise? So in New York, there's different datums. 0 is like there's 5 datums of 0. And so that's the other thing. NOAA uses a different datum than FEMA. And so, we all got together on NAVDA 88, and I think that's going out the door as well. So I'm happy to give you some cite some information, but The key is that you're developing it just like you would develop a base plan of a foundation of information. And nothing is wrong. It's just making sure that you're building the right foundation.
Thank you so much.
So excellent talk. Thank you very much. So there's a very large debate about how we should handle sea level rise. In particular, the idea that we should retreat, right? And we're seeing financially induced retreat, certainly from just insurance companies, right? People not getting insurance and things like that. And then there's, of course, hardening, and there's investment like this. So I would like to ask you kind of a two-part question. First, how many billions of dollars were spent here? Could you talk about that?
Sure.
And in light of actually this question about what's happening at the federal level, kind of what your thoughts are about the future. But if you were made the guru of coastal zone management in the United States, what would you do?
I'd be more tired than I am now. But so let's start with the first part, and that's an excellent question. And I think it's really important for us to talk about all of these things because things are changing. From the time that I started to write this lecture to now, things changed. And so we have to constantly adapt. And so this flood system that goes from 25th to Montgomery is 1.4 billion. And in New York, we just like spending $1 billion. It's no big deal. It's $1 billion. This is $1 billion. Used to be $1 million. Now it's $1 billion. So this is 1.4 bill. The thing about that is this was the first one. And so the consecutive other ones are other bills. So I would honestly say that this is only buying time. And in a history of New York where the industrial edge was all reclaimed as parkland. And so I kind of went through that, and so did my partner, Signe Nielsen and Kim Matthews, where we realized that we did so many waterfront parks. The question is, and that's why the Parks Department wanted to be elevated, was, are they going to give up that land? And are we going to retreat? And so many, many people are studying different types of retreat. And it's really important in academia that you guys are studying it because you can actually move faster than we can in practice. But it's an important aspect of it. And I think that it's important for all of you to think about. I think that I'm very influenced. Again, I'm an Atlantic coastal plain girl on the East. Besides 95, I love the beach and the drainage, all parts of the Atlantic coastal plain. But it was in a different place 13,000 years ago. And at certain place in time, someone drew that line and said, this is where the edge is. And so we've been lucky to break that edge and do more nature-based systems. And then also going through this, that was both loved and hated by the community, but that there's a certain surety that it's a passive system. There's a little bit of security of that. And I think it has to do with what is the level of risk that people are willing to be open to, and maybe talking about that. What's the second question? So I wish that people could fall in love with water systems. As a New Yorker who steals water from upstate and finds it delicious, Central Park was done because it needed a reservoir. Many things were done because we needed drinking water. And so I would love for people to, as I drink out of my, you know what I mean? Like I'm guzzling water out of plastic like everybody. But if we could understand these bigger systems and the importance of them, then they could help with decisions. But there's a lot of, just like any type of land and kind of natural systems, there's a lot of politics involved. And so I think I'm too much of a smart A to be in politics. And I think the other thing about it is it's just having people understand it. What the thing that gives me hope is we were the first precedent projects to do this in New York. By the second and third, the community knows just as much as we do. They're like, you're at 16.5, why are they at 18? What's the coastal storm you're doing? Are you doing it to 2050 or 2100? I mean, so the education about the systems that's been really satisfying to me. to see the community come along. And so that's the diagrams and the things you have to take to kind of explain those systems that are very complex. Thanks. Yeah. Pizza, right?
Yeah, we have pizza. Okay. We have pizza. So please join us in the first floor of West Architecture. Grab some pizza. If you didn't have a chance to ask your question to Molly, you can find her
Yeah.
there.
Happy to.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody.